I pressed the ice to my son's bruised ribs, promising to destroy the monster who did this. But as he wept, my skin still burned from that same monster's touch. I should have protected my boy. And said, I invited his tormentor into our home, and now, he is never leaving. The morning air in our corner of the Pacific coast always carries the same curated scent of expensive dark roast and freshly manicured lawns. I sat on the bleached redwood terrace, watching the heavy marine layer retreat into the horizon like a bashful ghost. Everything about this life was deliberate, from the crystal flutes catching the first amber rays of the sun to the silent hum of the pool filter. It was the kind of stillness that felt expensive, a silence purchased through decades of careful social climbing and strategic investments. I felt the condensation on my glass, a cold prickle against my palm that grounded me in this hollow perfection, yet I could not shake the feeling that the fog was merely hiding the cracks in my world. Across from me, Thomas was absorbed in the glowing screen of his tablet, his thumb moving with a rhythmic mechanical precision. He spoke in short, clipped sentences about market fluctuations and quarterly earnings, his voice blending into the ambient noise of the distant surf. At 45, he was the picture of suburban success, his linen shirt crisp and his silvering hair perfectly styled even at 8 in the morning. I nodded at the appropriate intervals, sipping my coffee and feeling the familiar weight of a boredom, so profound it felt like a physical presence. We were safe, we were wealthy, and we were utterly, agonizingly predictable in our daily rituals, trapped in a loop of high-end comfort. I looked at my own reflection in the polished silver creamer, seeing a woman of 40 who had mastered the art of being a decorative object. My skin was smooth, thanks to the finest creams and the absence of any real struggle, yet I felt a strange hunger gnawing at my edges. It was a desire for something jagged, something that could cut through the soft silk of my existence and draw blood. I smoothed the fabric of my cream-colored wrap, my fingers tracing the delicate embroidery, while my mind wandered toward the cliffs. The ocean below was violent and indifferent, a stark contrast to the manicured garden that surrounded us, and I found myself envying its chaotic and unbridled power. The domestic harmony was shattered by the sharp, grating sound of a wrought iron chair being dragged across the stone tiles. Leo slumped into his seat, his presence a sudden storm cloud in our sun-drenched sanctuary. At 20, he should have carried the easy confidence of a young man with the world at his feet, but instead he seemed smaller, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. He didn't reach for the bowl of fresh berries or the artisanal bread I had laid out so carefully. He kept his head down, his blonde hair falling forward like a curtain to hide his face from the world, and the silence that followed his arrival was heavy with an unspoken and suffocating dread. When Leo finally looked up, my breath caught in a throat that suddenly felt too tight for air. Beneath his left eye, a massive swollen hematoma was blooming in shades of ugly purple and sickly yellow, marring his pale skin. His lower lip was split, the raw tissue looking like a piece of torn fruit against the clinical whiteness of our breakfast table. Thomas stopped talking about stocks, his tablet clicking shut with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet air. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I hovered near his bruised face, wanting to touch him yet terrified of the pain I might cause. The violence of the outside world had finally found a way over our high garden walls. His voice was thin and brittle as he began to speak of him again, the name Jamal falling from his lips like a curse. He described the young athlete at the college, a man of immense strength and terrifying darkness who had chosen Leo as his personal target. He spoke of the locker room humiliations, the way the shadow of the man seemed to swallow him whole every time they crossed paths on campus. Leo's hands were shaking as he recounted the sheer, unbridled power of the man who tormented him. I listened to the details of the assault, the descriptions of raw muscle and effortless dominance, and I felt a strange, cold shiver slide down my spine that was not entirely born of maternal concern. I leaned across the table and took my son's hands in mine, my thumbs tracing the nervous, rapid pulse in his wrists. I promised him that I would handle it, that I would go to the school and ensure this animal was punished for what he had done to our family. My words were the standard script of a protective mother, but my heart was beating to a different, more primitive rhythm. As Leo wept quietly, I found myself visualizing the man he described, imagining the heat and the height of someone who could break my son with such casual ease. A dark, viscous curiosity began to pool in the pit of my stomach, a forbidden urge to see the face of the monster who had breached our paradise. Thomas stood up, his face reddening with a futile, civilized rage, and began pacing the length of the terrace while muttering about lawyers and dean of students. I didn't hear him. My senses were suddenly hyper-attuned to the world outside our gates. From the driveway below, the low, rhythmic thumping of a heavy bass line began to vibrate through the floorboards, a guttural sound that didn't belong in this neighborhood. It was a predatory vibration, growing louder and more insistent until it drowned out the cry of the gulls and the rustle of the palms. I looked down and saw a battered black muscle car idling at our curb, its tinted windows hiding the driver, while a single dark hand rested casually on the door frame. The parking lot of the regional sports complex was a shimmering expanse of asphalt that seemed to vibrate under the weight of the late afternoon sun. I sat inside my white SUV, the air conditioning humming a sterile tune that felt increasingly fragile against the rising temperatures outside. I watched the golden hour light bleed into the edges of the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete. The smell of hot rubber and sea salt drifted through the vents, creating a suffocating atmosphere that mirrored the tightening knot in my chest. I was here to protect my son, yet the very air felt heavy with a sense of impending and irreversible change. In my mind, I practiced the words over and over, refining my tone until it was the perfect blend of moral superiority and legal threat. I would tell him that his career was over before it began, that the police were a single phone call away, and that men like him did not touch boys like Leo. I clutched the steering wheel until my knuckles turned a ghostly white, my wedding ring biting into my skin as a reminder of the life I was supposed to defend. Every face that passed my window was a blur of youthful energy and mindless chatter, none of them carrying the weight of the violence that had been visited upon my home just hours before. The glass of the windshield felt hot to the touch when I finally decided to step out into the stifling, oppressive air. Groups of students moved in clusters, their laughter sounding like shards of glass against the backdrop of my burning purpose. I smoothed my designer dress, a garment that felt like armor in this world of gym bags and sweat-stained jerseys. The contrast was deliberate. I wanted to look like the authority that would crush his ambitions without a second thought. I leaned against the cool metal of the car door, my eyes scanning the crowd for a predator who moved with the confidence of someone who owned the very ground he walked upon. The sun began its slow descent, turning the sky into a bruised canvas of deep orange and violent crimson. I could hear the rhythmic thud of basketballs hitting the hardwood inside the building, a dull heartbeat that seemed to echo my own rising pulse. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of my neck, disappearing into the silk of my collar and leaving a cold trail of anxiety in its wake. This place was a temple of physicality, a cathedral of sweat and ambition that felt alien to my world of boardrooms and charity galas. I stood my ground, my heels clicking sharply against the sun-baked ground as I adjusted my sunglasses to hide the fear in my eyes. Then the double doors of the sports center swung open with a heavy, metallic clang that signaled the start of a final act. A group of athletes spilled out, their voices booming with the arrogant vitality of youth and the adrenaline of a finished practice. They were giants among men, their bodies honed to perfection through hours of grueling labor and repetitive motion. I searched their faces, looking for the specific brand of cruelty that Leo had described with such trembling fear. My breath hitched when I saw him at the back of the pack, a figure that seemed to command the space around him. Jamal moved with a predatory grace that made the others look like children. He was taller than I had imagined, a literal wall of muscle that seemed to absorb the fading light rather than reflect it. His skin was the color of rich, dark mahogany, glistening with a fine sheen of perspiration that highlighted every ripple of his powerful frame. He wore a simple sleeveless jersey that did nothing to hide the immense breadth of his shoulders, or the thick cords of muscle in his neck. There was a raw, primal energy radiating from him, a sense of power that was both terrifying and hypnotic. He didn't walk so much as he prowled, his dark eyes scanning the parking lot with an indifference that spoke of a man who feared absolutely nothing. As he approached, the air seemed to grow thinner and more charged with a strange electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. My prepared speech, those carefully constructed sentences of indignation and threat, began to crumble like dry sand in my mind. I forced myself to step forward, my movement deliberate and sharp, cutting through the path he was taking toward a dented black car. I felt the weight of his gaze before I even met his eyes, a heavy and suffocating sensation that made my heart hammer against my ribs. I was a mother on a mission of justice, yet I felt like an interloper in a territory where my status and my wealth held no currency. I raised my chin, trying to summon the ghost of my social standing to bolster my courage as he came to a sudden, jarring halt just inches from me. Up close, his physicality was overwhelming, a sensory assault of heat, salt, and the faint sweet scent of some deep musky oil. I could see the pulse thrumming in his throat, a steady and powerful rhythm that felt like a taunt to my own frantic internal state. His eyes were not filled with the shame I had expected to see. Instead, they were dark pools of mocking intelligence that seemed to read my every insecurity. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words died in my throat before they could be born into the humid air. "You must be Leo's mother," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in the very air between us like the growl of a distant engine. He didn't wait for a confirmation, his gaze sweeping over me with a slow, insolent scrutiny that felt more intimate than a touch. He looked at my manicured hair, my expensive jewelry, and the way my dress clung to my frame, his eyes lingering just long enough to make me feel exposed. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, filled with the sounds of the dying day and the distant roar of the ocean. I felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the sun, a rising tide of embarrassment and something else. I finally found my voice, though it sounded thin and foreign to my own ears as I told him that I knew what he was doing to my son. I spoke of the bruises, the fear, and the consequences that would surely follow if he did not cease his campaign of terror immediately. I mentioned the school board, the police, and my husband's influence, trying to wrap myself in the safety of my suburban life. Jamal listened with his head tilted slightly to the side, a small dark smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He didn't look like a boy being scolded by an elder. He looked like a predator who had found a new and far more interesting piece of prey to toy with in the dirt. "Is that what he told you?" he asked, stepping even closer until the heat radiating from his body was almost unbearable against my skin. He was so tall that I had to crane my neck back to maintain eye contact, a position that felt uncomfortably like a surrender. He violated my personal space with a casual arrogance that left me breathless, his massive frame casting a long shadow that completely enveloped me. I could smell the iron in his sweat and the raw vitality of his youth, a combination that made my head swim with a sudden dizzying intensity. I wanted to push him away, but my hands remained frozen at my sides, my fingers twitching against the expensive fabric. He reached out, his large dark hand moving with a slow deliberation that made time feel as though it were stretching and warping. He didn't touch me, but he moved his hand so close to my face that I could feel the warmth of his palm against my cheek. I should have flinched, I should have screamed, but I stood there like a statue, mesmerized by the sheer audacity of his movements. He was testing me, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable, and I was failing the test with every silent second that passed. The world around us, the students and the distant buildings, all faded into a gray blur, leaving only the two of us in a circle of white-hot tension. Jamal leaned down, his face descending toward mine until our breaths mingled in the stagnant air of the parking lot. His eyes were narrowed, searching mine for a weakness he seemed to have already identified with a hunter's precision. I saw the flecks of gold in the dark iris, the long lashes, and the smooth skin of his brow, and I felt a pang of something that felt like envy. He was so alive, so grounded in his own power, while I felt like a ghost haunting the corridors of my own perfect life. The anger that had sustained me on the drive over was being replaced by a dark, heavy weight that settled deep in my belly, a primal response that I could not easily name or ignore. "Your son is a weakling," he whispered, the words brushing against my ear like a physical caress that made me shiver despite the stifling heat. He spoke of Leo with a contempt that was so absolute it felt like a fact of nature, a truth that I had spent years trying to ignore. He told me that boys like Leo needed to be taught their place, and that perhaps his mother was the one who truly needed a lesson in reality. The sheer vulgarity of his tone should have disgusted me, yet I felt a jolt of electricity race through my veins, a spark of life that I hadn't felt in 20 years. He was stripping away my respectability with nothing more than his voice and his presence. He shifted his weight, his thigh brushing against mine through the thin silk of my dress, a contact that felt like a brand. It was a brief, seemingly accidental touch, but it sent a shockwave through my system that left me reeling and lightheaded. I looked up at him, my lips parted in a silent plea for something I didn't understand, my eyes wide with a mix of terror and a new, terrible hunger. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that I could no longer remember why I had come here, or what I had hoped to achieve. I was no longer a mother defending her cub. I was a woman standing in the presence of a force that demanded total and absolute submission. Jamal let out a soft, low chuckle that seemed to vibrate in his chest, a sound of pure triumph as he watched the resolve drain from my face. He knew he had won. He knew that the threat I represented had evaporated the moment he stepped into my space and looked down at me. He leaned in one last time, his lips almost touching the lobe of my ear, and murmured a suggestion so scandalous that it made the world tilt on its axis. It was an invitation to a darkness I hadn't known existed within me, a call to abandon everything I held dear for a taste of the raw, forbidden energy he carried. Then, as quickly as he had arrived, he stepped back, leaving me cold. He walked away without a backward glance, his gait easy and relaxed as he climbed into his car and started the engine with a roar that echoed through the nearly empty lot. I stood by my SUV, my legs feeling like lead and my heart racing with a frantic, uneven rhythm that I could not soothe. The smell of his musk lingered in the air, a phantom presence that seemed to stain the very atmosphere around me with its potency. I watched the tail lights of his car disappear into the twilight, feeling a sense of loss that was as profound as it was nonsensical. I had come to save my son, but as I sat back in my car, I realized that I was the one who had been captured. The drive back to the White House on the cliff was a blur of neon lights and darkening shadows, my mind replaying every second of the encounter with a feverish intensity. I could still feel the warmth of his breath on my skin, the weight of his gaze, and the way his presence had made the rest of the world feel thin and unimportant. I thought of Leo waiting for me at home, expecting a mother who had fought for him, and I felt a surge of shame that was quickly drowned out by a wave of illicit excitement. I had looked into the eyes of the monster, and instead of turning away in horror, I had found myself wanting to reach out and touch the darkness he offered. I walked through the front door, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a shroud that I desperately wanted to tear away. I could hear the faint sound of Leo's television from upstairs, a mindless drone that underscored the hollowness of our domestic peace. My hands were still trembling as I poured myself a glass of wine, the liquid dark and red like the bruises on my son's face. I knew that nothing would ever be the same, that the encounter in the parking lot had opened a door that I could never truly close again. I had found something in the heat and the dust that I hadn't realized I was searching for, and the hunger for it was already starting to consume me. The evenings in our sprawling colonial home began to feel like scenes from a high-budget play where every line was rehearsed and every gesture was hollow. I moved through the quiet corridors like a ghost, my silk robe whispering against the mahogany floors, while the scent of lavender candles tried to mask the heavy atmosphere of the house. Outside, the fog rolled in from the Pacific, thick and suffocating, pressing against the windows as if trying to reclaim the land. Everything was too white, too clean, and too silent for the storm that was currently raging within the marrow of my bones, a secret life that flourished only in the dark. Only 2 hours before the silver moon rose over our cliffs, I had been in a place that existed on the jagged, neglected edges of our polished world. The motel was a squat, concrete scar on the landscape, located in a district where the streetlights hummed with a sick, yellow frequency and the air tasted of exhaust. Inside those thin walls, the wallpaper peeled like sunburnt skin and the carpet held the ghost of 1,000 desperate encounters. It was there, amidst the flickering neon and the sound of distant sirens, that I shed the skin of a respectable mother and became something unrecognizable to myself. In the dim, unfiltered light of that room, Jamal stood as a towering monument of raw, unyielding energy that demanded my total and absolute surrender. His presence was like a physical weight, a gravitational pull that drew me into an orbit of danger and forbidden heat that I could no longer resist. I watched the way his shadow stretched across the stained ceiling, his massive form eclipsing the meager light until the world was reduced to the space between us. There were no polite introductions here, No gentle pretenses of romance, only the heavy rhythmic thrumming of a heart that beat with the force of a predator. His skin, the color of deep mahogany and bitter chocolate, was always hot to the touch, as if he carried a furnace within his chest that burned through the mundane. When his hands closed around my waist, they felt like iron bands, marking me with a strength that both terrified and exhilarated my dormant senses. I allowed myself to be molded by his will, a porcelain doll caught in the grip of a giant who knew exactly how much pressure it took to make me crack. In those moments, the 40 years of my life felt like a long gray winter that was finally being scorched away by a summer he had brought with him. I became addicted to the way he looked at me, with an insolence that stripped away my jewelry, my status, and my carefully constructed dignity until I was nothing but a pulse. He spoke very little, but when he did, his voice was a low vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my nervous system. He was a creature of movement and instinct, a stark contrast to the intellectual, sterile men who populated my social circles and my marriage. Every encounter was a descent into a dark, lush valley where the rules of the heights no longer applied and only the hunger remained. The drive back to my pristine neighborhood was always a descent into a different kind of madness, a slow process of putting the mask back on while my body still burned. I would sit in my car for 5 minutes in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel and breathing in the scent of him that clung to my hair and my clothes. It was the smell of musk, of rain on hot pavement, and of a wildness that did not belong in our cul-de-sac of manicured hedges. I had to scrub my skin until it was red in the shower, trying to wash away the evidence of my treason before I could face my family. One evening, I walked into Leo's room to find him sitting on the edge of his bed, his face illuminated by the cold, blue light of his laptop. He looked so fragile, so small compared to the man who had just pinned me against a cheap motel wall, and a wave of something dark and complex washed over me. He looked up, his eyes rimmed with red from crying, and gestured toward the fresh, dark bruises that now decorated his ribs like a macabre watercolor. He began to recount the day's torments, the way Jamal had cornered him in the locker room and laughed while he struggled to breathe. I sat beside him on the designer linens, my hand steady as I reached for the bowl of ice and the soft, white cloths I used to soothe his broken skin. As I pressed the cold compress against the purple welts on his chest, I felt a jolt of recognition that made my breath hitch in my throat. These were the same hands that 3 hours ago had been tangled in the hair of the very man who had inflicted this pain upon my child. The irony was a sharp, jagged needle that pierced through my heart, yet it brought with it a surge of forbidden, electric pleasure that I could not suppress. I whispered words of comfort to my son, telling him that he was safe, and that I was doing everything in my power to stop the monster who was hunting him. My voice was low and soothing, the perfect performance of a nurturing mother, while my mind replayed the way Jamal had looked at me as he exerted his power. I watched the tears track through the dust on Leo's cheeks, and instead of feeling a pure, clean grief, I felt a sense of awe at the reach of my lover's influence. Jamal was here in this room, present in every wince and every sob, a ghost that I had invited in. The relationship between my son's suffering and my own ecstasy became a tangled web that I could no longer unravel, nor did I want to. I found myself looking at Leo's injuries as secret messages from the dark, physical proof of the strength that I craved in the late hours of the night. Every time my son described a new act of bullying, a part of me thrilled at the confirmation of Jamal's dominance, as if his violence toward the son was a prelude to his passion for the mother. It was a sick circular logic that fueled a fire that was quickly burning through the foundations of my sanity. Thomas would join us later, standing in the doorway with a glass of scotch in his hand and a look of helpless, impotent frustration on his handsome, aging face. He would talk about calling the dean again, about hiring a private investigator, or about moving Leo to a different school altogether to escape the harassment. I would nod and agree, playing the part of the concerned wife, while feeling a profound sense of contempt for his civilized, orderly approach to a primal problem. Thomas was a man of words and contracts, but he had no idea how to deal with a force of nature that didn't play by the rules. During dinner, the table became a battlefield of unspoken tensions and hidden agendas, the clink of silver against china sounding like the ticking of a time bomb. I would look at Thomas across the candles and wonder what he would do if he knew that the wine I was sipping tasted like the sweat of the man who was breaking our son. I felt a sense of power in my deception, a feeling of being the only one in the room who truly understood the nature of the world we lived in. I was the bridge between the light and the dark, the keeper of a secret that could destroy us all in a single heartbeat. When Thomas kissed me goodnight, his lips were soft and familiar, a comfort that felt like a death sentence to a woman who had tasted the fire of the outskirts. I would close my eyes and try to conjure the image of my husband, but Jamal's face would inevitably intrude, his dark eyes mocking me from the shadows of my own mind. The betrayal was not just an act. It was a lingering flavor on my tongue, a rich and complex vintage that I drank until I was intoxicated by my own depravity. I was falling, but the sensation of the wind against my skin was so beautiful that I forgot to be afraid of the ground. The addiction to the danger became so strong that I began to take risks that would have seemed unthinkable only a few weeks before. I started wearing pieces of jewelry that Jamal had touched, as if they were talismans that could bring him closer to me even when I was surrounded by the safety of my home. I would walk through the grocery store or the country club, feeling the weight of my secret like a heavy golden chain around my neck. I looked at the other women in their sun hats and tennis skirts and felt a surge of predatory pride, knowing that I had stepped off the path they were so carefully following. In the quiet hours of the early morning, I would lie awake and listen to the breathing of my husband, feeling like a stranger in my own bed. The house, with all its expensive art and high ceilings, felt like a cage that was slowly shrinking around me, threatening to crush the new wild thing I had become. I found myself counting the hours until the sun would set again, until the fog would roll in, and I could justify another trip to the edges of the city. My life had become a countdown to the next moment of submission, a journey toward a center that was increasingly dark and increasingly hollow. I realized that I no longer knew where the mother ended and the lover began, as if the two roles had bled into each other to create a new monstrous entity. I was nursing the wounds that my own desires had helped to create, a cycle of pain and pleasure that had no clear exit and no moral compass. The salt air from the ocean drifted through the open window, cold and indifferent to the drama unfolding within the white walls of our coastal sanctuary. I was a woman drowning in a sea of my own making, and as I watched the first light of dawn touch the horizon, I knew I would not call for help. The Pacific wind was a restless beast that night, clawing at the thick panes of our floor-to-ceiling windows with a persistent, mournful howl. I stood in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the glowing embers in the hearth and the distant rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam across the waves. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, a woman I hardly recognized, her eyes burning with a feverish and predatory light that seemed to devour the shadows. My movements had become sharper, more calculated, as if I were constantly stalking some invisible prey within the sterile confines of my own home. I felt the fine silk of my robe clinging to my skin like a second, more honest layer of identity. Thomas was watching me from his deep leather armchair, his glass of aged whiskey resting precariously on the armrest as he studied my silhouette against the night. He had been quiet all evening, his brow furrowed with a concern that he mistook for shared maternal grief over our son's recent plight. He saw the way I paced the room, the way my hands hovered over the cold surfaces of our expensive furniture without ever truly touching them. He thought I was unraveling under the pressure of the trauma, a fragile mother pushed to the brink by the cruelty of a stranger. He had no idea that the fire in my eyes was fueled by a memory of a dark hand and the scent of salt. The air in the room felt heavy and stagnant, saturated with the smell of wood smoke and the expensive floral perfume I used to mask the traces of my double life. Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice a low and soothing murmur that felt like a dull blade scraping against my raw and hypersensitive nerves. He spoke about the need for a change, for a way to restore the balance that had been stolen from our sanctuary by the violence at the college campus. I watched his mouth move, the familiar lines of his face appearing like a map I no longer wished to follow. Every word he uttered was a testament to his own ignorance, a civilized response to a problem that was primal. He suggested that we hire a professional, perhaps a retired officer or a specialized trainer, to act as a bodyguard for Leo until this situation was finally resolved. He spoke of defensive tactics and psychological resilience, his tone clinical and detached, as if he were discussing a corporate merger rather than our son's physical safety. I had to turn away toward the window, my fingers curling into the palms of my hands to keep from laughing aloud at the sheer and ridiculous irony of his plan. He wanted to bring a guardian into our house to protect us from a wolf that I was already feeding with my own flesh in the dead of the night. The absurdity was a bitter nectar. In the dark reflection of the glass, I saw a vision of Jamal standing in the center of our pristine living room, his massive and dark frame dwarfing the designer chairs. I imagined the weight of his presence crushing the delicate aesthetic of our lives, his raw energy stripping away the thin veneers of our respectability. He would look at the modern art on the walls and the crystal on the sideboard with the same mocking indifference he showed toward me. The thought of him here, in this space that Thomas had built with such careful precision, sent a jolt of illicit electricity through my veins. He was already here in spirit, a shadow that had grown long enough to eclipse us all. I managed to murmur a vague agreement, my voice sounding like a recording of someone else's life while my mind remained miles away in a flickering motel room. Thomas seemed satisfied with my compliance, leaning back and taking a slow sip of his whiskey, convinced that he had taken the first step toward fixing our broken world. He reached out to pat my hand, his touch feeling cold and papery compared to the scorching heat I had come to crave from a different source. I forced a brittle smile, a mask that felt as though it might shatter at any moment under the weight of the lies I was piling up. We sat there in the silence of the house, two strangers sharing a history. Later, as the great house finally settled into a restless and creaking slumber, I lay in the vast expanse of our bed, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the man I had married. The sheets felt like a shroud, the high thread count caught in a suffocating reminder of the life I was supposed to be content with for the rest of my days. My phone, hidden beneath the silk of my pillow, let out a short and sharp vibration that felt like a physical strike against my skull. I didn't need to look at the glowing screen to know who it was or what the message contained. It was a command, not a request, a summons from the darkness that ignored the hour and the danger of my life. I waited until I was absolutely certain that Thomas was lost in a deep sleep before I slid out from under the covers with the practiced silence of a thief. My bare feet met the cold and polished tiles of the floor, a sensation that sent a sharp chill up my spine and grounded me in the reality of my betrayal. I didn't bother with shoes or a coat, my body driven by a thirst that was far stronger than any fear of discovery or physical discomfort. I moved through the dark hallway, my hands guiding me along the walls like a blind woman navigating a familiar maze. The house felt alien in the moonlight, a museum of a life that I was ready to burn to the ground. The heavy oak door groaned softly as I opened it, the salt-laden air of the Pacific rushing in to greet me like a long-lost lover returning from the sea. I stepped out onto the stone terrace, my breath hitching in my throat as the freezing wind whipped through my thin nightgown, molding the fabric to the curves of my body. The descent to the beach was a blur of jagged stones and damp sand, my toes sinking into the earth as I hurried toward the flickering lights of the distant pier. I felt like a fugitive, a woman running away from her own reflection toward a destiny that was as dark as the water crashing against the cliffs. The risk was a drug heightening my senses. He was waiting for me at the end of the narrow access road, the black muscle car idling in the shadows like a large and prehistoric beast. The engine's low and guttural thrum was a sound that resonated in my very marrow, a predatory hum that signaled the end of my civilized existence for the night. I approached the vehicle, my heart hammering against my ribs with a violence that made me feel lightheaded and weak in the knees. The driver's side window slid down with a mechanical hiss, revealing the sharp and dark silhouette of the man who had become my absolute master. Jamal didn't say a word. He simply looked at me, his gaze a heavy weight that demanded I obey. I climbed into the passenger seat, the smell of cheap tobacco and old leather immediately enveloping me in a world that was 1,000 miles away from my White House. The interior of the car was a cramped and dark sanctuary where the only light came from the glowing dashboard and the occasional sweep of a distant headlight. Jamal sat behind the wheel, his massive shoulders blocking out the view of the ocean, his presence filling the cabin until there was no room for anything else. He reached out and gripped the back of my neck, his fingers warm and rough against my skin, pulling me toward him with an effortless strength that made my resolve dissolve into a puddle of heat. Every touch from him was a reminder of the power he held over my life, a physical manifestation of the secret that was slowly consuming the foundations of my family. He moved his hand from my neck to my jaw, his thumb tracing the line of my lips with a slow and deliberate pressure that felt like a brand upon my soul. I looked into his eyes and saw the absolute certainty of a man who knew he could destroy everything I loved with a single phone call. He was not just my lover. He was the architect of my ruin, and the realization of his total dominance was a source of an agonizing and twisted pleasure. I was a prisoner who loved the bars. We sat there for a long time in the pulsing darkness of the car, the only sound the rhythmic crash of the surf and the steady, heavy breathing of the man beside me. He spoke to me in low and harsh whispers, telling me about the things he had done to Leo that day, describing the way my son had cowered and begged for mercy. He made me listen to every detail, forcing me to confront the reality of my betrayal, even as he pulled me closer into his orbit of violence and heat. I felt a surge of nausea that was quickly overwhelmed by a wave of intense and forbidden arousal, a chemical reaction to the sheer and unadulterated wrongness of our secret connection. He mocked the idea of the bodyguard Thomas had suggested, his laughter a dark and resonant sound that seemed to fill the very space inside my lungs and heart. He told me that no man Thomas hired could ever protect the boy from what was coming, and that the only reason Leo was still walking was because of the price I was paying. I felt the weight of that sacrifice like a heavy and golden crown, a burden that I wore with a mix of deep shame and a terrifying predatory pride. I was the one who was keeping the peace, the bridge between the victim and the victimizer, and the power of that position was a drug that I could not quit even if I tried. As the first hint of gray began to touch the horizon over the ocean, Jamal pushed me away, his movement sudden and dismissive as if he were bored with the toy. He told me to go back to my husband and my broken son, to play the part of the perfect mother until he decided it was time for us to meet again. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaking and my skin tingling from the cold air, and the lingering ghost of his touch on my thighs. I watched the tail lights of his car disappear into the fog, feeling a sense of abandonment that was more painful than any physical blow he could have landed. I was alone on the beach, a ghost. I climbed back up the cliffs, my feet bleeding from the sharp stones and my nightgown stained with the salt and grime of the shore. The house looked different as I approached it, no longer a sanctuary but a sterile and white tomb where I was condemned to spend my days in mourning. I slipped back through the oak door and moved through the silent rooms, the cold tiles under my feet feeling like a penance I was more than willing to pay. I reached the bedroom and slid back under the covers, my body still radiating the heat of the encounter while Thomas slept on, oblivious to the fact that his wife had been forged into a weapon against his own home. I lay there with my eyes wide open, watching the light slowly reclaim the room, the shadows of the furniture stretching out like long and dark fingers across the walls. The domestic peace of our life felt like a fragile glass ornament that had already been shattered, held together only by the strength of my lies. I thought about the bodyguard Thomas wanted to hire and realized that the real danger was already inside the house, living in the space between my heartbeats. I was the infection, the silent rot that was turning our perfect dream into a noir nightmare. And as the sun finally rose, I found that I didn't care about being saved by any man. The breakfast table that morning was a masterpiece of suburban normalcy, the smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread filling the air with a false sense of security. I sat across from Thomas and Leo, my eyes hidden behind a pair of dark glasses, my voice steady as I discussed the plans for the day. I watched my son pick at his food, his face still marred by the violence of the man I had just left, and I felt a strange and detached sense of observation. I was no longer just a participant in this story. I was the director who held all the strings, and the realization brought with it a sense of calm that was more terrifying than a storm. Thomas spoke about a candidate he had found for the security position, a man with an impressive resume and years of experience in high-risk environments. I listened to the details, nodding at the appropriate moments, while my mind was already imagining the next text message and the next midnight summons. The hunger was a constant and gnawing presence in my gut, a reminder that the life I was leading was merely a costume I wore during the daylight hours. I looked at the white walls of our home and saw only a blank canvas, waiting for the shadows to return and paint it in the colors of my own magnificent and irreversible ruin in the dark. As I reached for my cup, my hand remained perfectly still, a testament to the new and cold control I had over my own physical form. I caught my reflection in the silver spoon and saw a woman who was finally and utterly awake, her spirit no longer bound by the petty moralities of her neighbors. The ocean outside continued its endless and indifferent assault on the cliffs, a rhythmic reminder that some forces are too powerful to be contained by walls or laws. I was one of those forces now, a creature of the tide and the moon, waiting for the world to catch up to the darkness I had embraced. The stage was set for the final act. The afternoon sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a mix of violent indigo and sickly yellow that reflected perfectly in the polished marble of our foyer. I stood by the antique grandfather clock, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the house, a sound that usually brought me comfort but now felt like a countdown. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the salty tang of the incoming tide, a combination that felt increasingly like a floral shroud over a decaying secret. I adjusted the lace cuff of my blouse, my fingers brushing against the faint, fading mark on my wrist that only I could see, a reminder of a strength I had come to crave. The silence was suddenly punctured by the frantic rattling of the front door, a sound so desperate it made the crystal chandelier above me chime in a dissonant, fragile chorus. Leo stumbled into the house, his hair matted with sweat and his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps that suggested a man who had been running from a ghost. He didn't look like the son of a wealthy man in that moment. He looked like a broken animal seeking a burrow to hide in. He collapsed against the white wall, leaving a faint smear of dirt that looked like a scar on the perfect surface of our domestic sanctuary, his eyes wide with a terror that I found strangely distant. I moved toward him, my steps light and deliberate, yet I felt a strange and icy detachment begin to settle over my heart like a winter frost. He reached for my hands, his fingers cold and trembling with a fear so profound it seemed to vibrate through his entire frame, but I felt nothing but a cool and clinical curiosity. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the hallway as if he expected a predator to materialize from the shadows of our own living room. I felt the weight of his fear, but instead of the warm tide of maternal instinct, I felt a sharp and jagged edge of irritation at his absolute and total lack of resolve in the face of a true power. He began to babble, his voice cracking and rising into a high hysterical pitch that grated against my ears like a serrated blade on a metal pipe. He told me that Jamal had caught him behind the library, pinning him against the cold brick until he could not breathe, whispering promises that were far more terrifying than any physical blow. Jamal had told him that their relationship was about to become much closer, a promise of intimacy that implied a total and final invasion of Leo's life. My son was begging me to call the police, to call the governor, to do anything to save him from the dark gravity of the man I had secretly embraced in the dead of the night. I looked down at his tear-stained face, seeing the reflection of my own husband's softness in the curve of his jaw and the weakness of his trembling chin. For 20 years I had nurtured this boy, protecting him from every storm and shielding him from the harsh realities of the world. Yet in this moment I found his vulnerability repulsive. The contrast between his frantic sobbing and the calm, terrifying power of the man who had broken him was a chasm that I could no longer bridge with sympathy. I realized that I did not want a son who begged for mercy. I wanted the fire that burned in the eyes of the one who was hunting him down with such ease. My voice was a cool, rehearsed melody as I whispered that everything would be handled, that I would personally see to it that Jamal never touched him again. I led him to the stairs, my hand on his back feeling the frantic thudding of his heart, a rhythmic weakness that only served to deepen my secret contempt for his fragility. I was a mother performing a role, a master of the double-take, while my mind was already racing toward the darkness of the coming night. I waited until he was safely tucked into his bed, shivering under the expensive linens, before I allowed my true face to emerge in the silence of the hallway, a face that was hungry for the night. The drive to the high school stadium was a journey through a landscape of shifting shadows and flickering streetlights that seemed to pulse with my own mounting anticipation. The air outside was cold and damp, a heavy mist clinging to the palm trees and turning the suburban streets into a ghostly monochromatic dreamscape. I felt a sense of liberation as I left the White House behind, my identity as a wife and mother falling away like a discarded garment. I was a woman of 40 heading toward a collision with a force I could not control, and the thrill of the danger was more intoxicating than any wine I had ever tasted in my sterile, perfect life. I parked in the deserted lot, the sound of my car door closing echoing through the empty stands like a final, definitive statement. The stadium loomed over me, a massive structure of steel and concrete, that felt like an ancient arena where the rules of civilization were suspended in the dark. The smell of cut grass and ozone was thick in the air, a sensory reminder of the physicality that defined this space and the man I was here to meet. I walked toward the chain-link fence that surrounded the field, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement, a rhythmic countdown to a confrontation that I both feared and hungered for with a passion that felt like sickness. Jamal was waiting for me near the end zone, a dark and massive silhouette that seemed to absorb the meager light from the distant security lamps. He was leaning against the fence, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence so immense that the stadium itself seemed to shrink in his shadow. I could hear the steady, deep rhythm of his breathing, a sound that grounded me in the reality of his physical power and the absolute danger of my position. He did not move as I approached, his eyes tracking my every movement with the cold and patient gaze of a hunter who knew his prey had nowhere left to run and no desire to escape the coming strike. I tried to summon the anger of a mother, my voice trembling with a practiced indignation as I demanded that he leave my son alone and end his campaign of terror. I spoke of the police and the consequences, trying to use the tools of my world to intimidate a man who clearly lived by a different and more primal set of laws. My words felt thin and hollow, drifting away in the cold night air like smoke from a dying fire, while Jamal watched me with a growing and mocking amusement. He took a single step forward, and the sheer weight of his proximity was enough to silence the protests that were dying in my throat before they could be born into the night. He let out a low, resonant laugh that vibrated in his chest and echoed through the empty bleachers, a sound of pure and unadulterated triumph over my pathetic attempts at authority. He moved with a speed that was shocking for a man of his size, his hand reaching out to grip the fence behind me, trapping me between the cold metal and the heat of his body. The smell of his skin, a mix of salt, musk and a deep earthy vitality, overwhelmed my senses and made the world tilt on its axis. I was no longer a woman of status, I was a creature caught in a snare, and the realization sent a jolt of lightning through my spine that felt like a long-forgotten life. His other hand moved to my neck, his fingers closing around my throat with a slow and deliberate pressure that was not intended to cause pain, but to demonstrate absolute ownership. I looked up at him, my breath hitching as I met the dark and impenetrable depths of his eyes, seeing the reflection of my own corruption staring back at me. He leaned in until his lips were inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin, and told me that the game of playing the concerned mother was over. He knew exactly what I was, and he knew that the more he hurt my son, the more I would find myself drawn back to the source of that violence to beg for more of the same. Then came the ultimatum, delivered in a voice that was as cold and sharp as a shard of mountain ice, stripping away the last of my precious and fragile illusions. He told me that I would continue to come to him, to obey his every whim and surrender to his will, or he would destroy the life I had built with a single devastating blow. He spoke of the videos he had taken of our encounters, recordings that would be sent to Thomas and Leo if I ever dared to step out of line or refuse his demands. The thought of my son seeing his mother in the arms of his tormentor was a horror beyond words, yet I felt a surge of adrenaline that was indistinguishable from joy. Jamal's grip tightened slightly, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a predatory tenderness that made me shiver with a mix of terror and an intense, forbidden longing. He told me that from this moment forward, I belonged to him in a way that no contract or marriage could ever define, a soul-deep connection forged in the fires of betrayal and salt. I looked at the dark skin of his hand against my own pale neck and felt the final collapse of my moral compass, the needle spinning wildly until it pointed toward the darkness. I realized that I did not want to be saved, and I did not want him to stop. I wanted to be consumed by the fire he had lit in my soul. The line between the protector and the betrayer, the mother and the lover, finally vanished into the gray mist of the stadium night, leaving only the raw and unadulterated truth of my desire. I reached up and placed my hands on his chest, feeling the massive and steady heartbeat of the man who was systematically dismantling my family, and I felt a sense of homecoming. I was no longer fighting for Leo's safety. I was fighting for my own survival in a world that had become beautiful in its ugliness and rich in its depravity. Jamal smiled, a slow and dark expression of victory, and I knew that the descent into the abyss had only just begun in earnest for all of us. We stayed there for a long time in the shadow of the fence, the cold metal biting into my back while the heat of his presence offered a different, more dangerous kind of comfort. The world outside the stadium walls felt like a distant and unimportant dream, a place where people lived small and safe lives that I could no longer understand or relate to. I had found my place in the dark, a role that demanded everything I had and promised only more of the same exquisite ruin that I had come to crave. As the wind howled through the empty stands, I closed my eyes and allowed the darkness to swallow me whole, a willing victim of a master I had chosen in the cold. The walk back to my car felt like moving through deep water, my body heavy with the realization of my total and final submission to the man who was breaking my home. I looked back at the stadium one last time, seeing the silhouette of Jamal as he disappeared into the night, a phantom who would haunt every hour of my waking life from now on. The fear was still there, a cold and constant companion in the pit of my stomach, but it was now entwined with a hunger that was far more powerful and far more honest. I started the engine, the roar of the car a small and futile defiance against the silence of the night that was now my only true and honest home. I drove back to the White House on the cliff, the moonlight reflecting off the ocean in a jagged silver path that seemed to lead directly toward my own magnificent destruction. I knew that when I walked through the front door, I would have to look into the eyes of my broken son and my oblivious husband, and I knew that I would do it with a smile. The mask was no longer a burden. It was a tool, a way to keep the secret safe until the next time I could escape into the heat and the salt of the outskirts. I was a traitor in the house of my own heart, and as I turned into the driveway, I felt a sense of peace that was as deep as the Pacific Sea. The air in the foyer was still cool and smelled of expensive wax, a scent that now felt like an insult to the raw and primal world I had just left behind in the stadium shadows. I paused by the mirror, looking at the faint redness on my neck and the wild, dark fire in my eyes, and I felt a surge of predatory pride in my own corruption. I was the architect of a nightmare, a woman who had traded the safety of her child for the thrill of her own ruin, and the weight of that choice felt like a crown of thorns that I wore with joy. I climbed the stairs toward the rooms of the men I was betraying, my steps silent and sure in the dark of the night. I reached my bedroom and slid back into the bed beside Thomas, the warmth of his body a dull and muted thing compared to the furnace I had just stood beside in the night. I lay there with my eyes wide open, watching the shadows of the palms dance across the ceiling like the fingers of a giant reaching for my throat. I thought about the videos, the ultimatum, and the promises of a closer relationship with my son, and I felt a final lingering shiver of anticipation. The crisis had passed, replaced by a new and terrible order that I had embraced with both hands, and as the first light of dawn broke through the fog, I found I was finally ready. The morning light began to filter through the heavy silk curtains, turning the room into a chamber of pale gold and gray shadows that seemed to mock the domestic peace I was supposed to represent. I could hear the distant sound of the surf, a constant and rhythmic reminder that the world was moving on, indifferent to the moral collapse occurring within these pristine white walls. I looked at the sleeping face of my husband and felt a strange, detached pity for a man who believed his world was secure, unaware of the predator I had invited to tea. My journey into the dark was no longer a secret I kept from the light. It was the very air that I breathed. 3 months have drifted by like a slow-moving tide, pulling the wreckage of my old life out to sea and leaving behind a shore that is impossibly smooth and pristine. The high summer sun now hangs over our coastal enclave with a lazy golden intensity that turns the Pacific into a sheet of hammered silver. Everything in our world has returned to its rightful polished place, yet the air itself feels different, as if it has been charged with a secret current that only I can perceive. I stand on the master balcony of our White House, the salt breeze tugging at the hem of my silk dress, feeling the weight of a triumph so profound it borders on the divine. The backyard is a vibrant tapestry of suburban excellence, a sea of crisp white linens and sparkling glassware that catches the light like scattered diamonds. The scent of rosemary-infused steaks and expensive charcoal drifts up from the stone terrace, mingling with the floral perfume of the gardens and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the waves. It is a celebration for the end of the semester, a gathering of the elite to mark another season of success and safety within our protected walls. Laughter ripples through the air like the sound of small silver bells, a chorus of voices that have never known the sharp edge of a true and honest terror. Thomas stands at the massive stainless steel grill, his face flushed with the heat and the easy satisfaction of a host who knows he is admired by every guest in attendance. He is in his element, holding a glass of chilled white wine and gesturing expansively as he recounts a humorous anecdote to a circle of attentive neighbors. He looks younger, more vibrant, the lines of worry that once etched his brow having vanished beneath the surface of a new and profound domestic peace. He is a man who believes he has conquered the shadows of his household, unaware that the light he cherishes is merely a reflection of the fire I have carefully stoked in the dark. Across the manicured lawn, Leo is moving among his peers with a newfound quiet confidence that makes my heart skip a beat with a mix of pride and a cold, detached awe. Gone are the hunched shoulders and the darting, fearful eyes that once defined his presence in this very garden just a short season ago. He looks stronger, his posture straight and his movements deliberate, as if he has finally found his footing in a world that used to overwhelm him with its raw and chaotic energy. He is a boy who has been broken and remade into something far more resilient, a vessel that has been emptied of its fear and filled with a strange submissive calm. Then there is the guest of honor, the man whose presence in our home is the ultimate testament to the intricate and beautiful lie I have woven into the fabric of our lives. Jamal stands near the pool, his massive and dark frame a striking contrast to the pale, sun-drenched architecture of our sanctuary. He is dressed in a tailored linen shirt that I chose for him myself, the fabric struggling to contain the sheer power of the muscles beneath. He moves through the crowd with an effortless, predatory grace, his every step a silent declaration of ownership that goes unnoticed by everyone but me. He is no longer the monster in the shadows, he is the savior we invited in. It was surprisingly easy to convince Thomas that a young man from a disadvantaged background deserved a chance at a better future through our personal and financial intervention. I spoke to him in the quiet hours of the night about the redemptive power of mentorship and the responsibility of the privilege to uplift those who show true potential. I painted a picture of a misunderstood athlete who only needed a firm hand and a supportive environment to find his true path in the world. Thomas, ever the believer in the nobility of his own influence, had embraced the idea with a fervor that made me want to scream with the sheer and delicious irony of it all. Now Jamal is a recipient of a scholarship funded by our family foundation, an official protege whose future is now inextricably linked to the very people he once sought to destroy. He has become a regular fixture in our home, a constant presence who sits at our table and drinks our wine while I watch from the head of the board. The neighbors admire us for our progressive spirit and our commitment to social justice, seeing only the beautiful facade of a family doing good in a troubled world. They cannot see the dark threads of the web I have spun, or the way the predator has been brought into the heart of the flock to serve as its most loyal guardian. I watch from my elevated vantage point as Jamal approaches my son, his movement fluid and natural as he enters Leo's personal space without a hint of the previous hostility. He reaches out and places a large, dark hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture that appears to the world as an act of brotherly affection and guidance from a mentor to a student. Leo does not flinch. Instead, he turns his head and nods with a look of profound, trustful submission that makes my skin tingle with a dark and electric satisfaction. The victim and the victimizer are now bound together in a partnership of my own design, a perfect and horrifying harmony that I have curated. Jamal looks up then, his dark and impenetrable eyes finding mine across the distance of the lawn with the accuracy of a heat-seeking missile. There is no shame in his gaze, only a burning and silent acknowledgement of the victory we have shared, and the secret price that continues to be paid in the shadows. He is the master of this house in every way that truly matters, his power rooted in the flesh and the marrow rather than the deeds and the titles that Thomas holds so dear. I feel the heat of his gaze like a physical touch on my skin, a reminder of the midnight hours and the salt-stained encounters that have forged this new and absolute reality. Thomas leaves the grill and begins to make his way toward the stairs that lead to the balcony, his footsteps heavy and certain on the stone path. I don't turn around, continuing to stare down at the garden where the predator and the prey are now sharing a laugh over a tray of hors d'oeuvres. I feel a sense of absolute control, a feeling of being the only person in the world who is truly and completely awake while everyone else is lost in a pleasant, sunlit dream. I have achieved the impossible. I have kept my family together, secured my son's peace, and invited my own magnificent ruin into the very center of my life to stay forever. I feel Thomas's arms wrap around my waist from behind, his touch familiar and soft as he pulls me against his chest and rests his chin on my shoulder. He breathes in the scent of my hair, a sound of deep and contented sighing that tells me everything I need to know about the success of my deception. He is a happy man, a man who believes he has a wife of extraordinary wisdom and a son who has overcome the trials of his youth through the power of a good example. He holds me as if I were a fragile treasure, unaware that he is embracing the very person who has dismantled the morality of his home and replaced it with a dark and beautiful poison. "Look at them, Alice," he whispers into my ear, his voice thick with a genuine and misplaced pride that makes the air feel heavy with the weight of his ignorance. He gestures toward Jamal and Leo, who are now deep in conversation near the water's edge, their silhouettes framed by the setting sun and the sparkling blue of the pool. He tells me that he was wrong to doubt my instincts, that bringing Jamal into their lives was the smartest thing we have ever done as a couple. He thanks me for my kindness and my vision, his words a symphony of accidental cruelty that I drink in like the finest and most expensive vintage of wine. I lean back into his embrace, allowing myself to enjoy the warmth of his body and the security of his love, even as my eyes remain locked on the man standing below us. I tell Thomas that I only wanted what was best for our son, and that seeing them like this is the greatest reward I could have ever imagined for my efforts. My voice is steady and full of a manufactured grace, a performance that has become so natural to me that I sometimes forget where the lie ends and the truth begins. I am the hero of this story in the eyes of my husband, a saint of the suburbs who has transformed a conflict into a beautiful and lasting friendship. Jamal shifts his position, the muscles of his back rippling beneath the thin linen as he turns to say something to a passing guest, his charisma filling the yard. He is a king in this garden, a man who has traded the violence of the streets for the refined luxury of the cliffs without losing a single ounce of his primal and terrifying edge. He knows that every piece of bread he eats and every drop of wine he drinks is a tribute to the power he holds over the woman standing on the balcony above him. He is the secret wrought at the core of our perfection, the dark stain that makes the rest of the canvas seem so much brighter and more alive. I smile down at him, a small and secret expression that is meant only for his eyes, a silent confirmation of our pact and the absolute triumph of our shared depravity. I have managed to weave a world where the laws of man and God have been suspended in favor of a deeper and more honest hunger that knows no boundaries. I have my husband's devotion, my son's safety, and the constant, burning presence of the man who breaks me every night in the dark of the guest house. It is a masterpiece of manipulation, a living noir where the ending is happy only for those who are brave enough to embrace the shadows and live within the lie. The sun finally dips below the horizon, casting long and distorted shadows across the grass, and turning the ocean into a vast and dark void that stretches out to the edge of the world. The party continues, the music growing louder and the laughter more frequent, as the stars begin to emerge in the velvet sky of the Pacific coast. I feel a sense of absolute and total harmony, a feeling that every choice I have made has led me to this perfect and terrible moment of completion. The air is cool now, but the heat within my own blood is enough to sustain me through 1,000 lifetimes of betrayal and secret, midnight joys. Thomas kisses the side of my neck, his lips a gentle and mundane reminder of the world I am supposed to inhabit, a world that I have long since abandoned in my heart. I close my eyes and imagine the feeling of Jamal's hands on my skin, the weight of his body and the scent of the salt air that always seems to follow him into the room. I am a woman who has found her true north in the center of a hurricane, a creature of the tide who has learned to love the crushing pressure of the deep. There is no guilt, no regret, only the sweet and lingering taste of a victory that has been bought with the soul of my own home. The sea whispers to the rocks below, a rhythmic and ancient sound that speaks of secrets kept in lives consumed by the relentless and indifferent power of the water. I listen to the waves and feel a sense of kinship with the dark, a realization that I have finally become as vast and as dangerous as the ocean itself. This is my kingdom, a place of white walls and black hearts, where the light is only used to hide the beauty of the things that happen in the shadows. I am Alice, the mother, the wife, and the lover, and I have never felt more alive than I do in this moment of perfect and irreversible ruin. I turn in Thomas's arms and look at him with a gaze that is full of a terrifying and radiant love, a love that is fueled by the very secret that would destroy him if he knew. I tell him that I love our life, and that I would not change a single second of the journey that has brought us to this beautiful and serene evening on the cliff. He smiles, his heart full of a simple and honest joy, and leads me back toward the guests and the laughter and the flickering candles of the garden. As we descend the stairs, I catch the eye of the man waiting for me at the bottom, and I know that the night is only just beginning. The sweetness of the betrayal is a thick and golden nectar on my tongue, a flavor that I will savor for as long as the sun continues to rise over this perfect and cursed coastline. I walk into the light of the party, a queen among her subjects, carrying the darkness within me like a precious and glowing coal that will never go out. The harmony of our life is absolute, a symphony of lies and desires that plays on even as the world outside continues its blind and pointless struggle. I am finally at peace, a prisoner of my own triumph, waiting for the moon to rise and the real work of the night to begin in the quiet.